As Black as Resistance, Chapter 3 Grounds to Defend On. Self-defense is of the utmost importance in the United States. If you can afford to run from what's threatening you and are interested in continuing your existence, you should learn how to fight where you stand. It's something that has consistently defined the United States long after the Revolutionary War. The concept of resisting tyrannical government through arms is ingrained in consciousness across the Americas. Nations birthed through fighting and revolutions against colonial empires glorify their histories of resistance and defense. The United States is no exception and certainly praises this aspect of its history. But the history of rebellion against the U.S. project itself is often glossed over as if an inconvenience to the supposed freedoms we enjoy today. Those of us who believe in human rights and equality have to imagine resistance beyond just words, symbolism, and attitudes. Resistance should also carry a realistic outlook that includes a self-defense strategy. History has regularly given us guidelines for doing so. Consideration and understanding of individual and community self-defense is mandatory for the movements we hope to build and maintain. In this white supremacist society, movements that challenge the status quo are often violently dismissed. Though Black-led resistance has been very effective in challenging and changing conditions, Black people have often paid with our lives. Whenever there is a dominant system that enables or privileges certain groups over others, violence against those considered lesser is increasingly justified by that system, especially against those defying that system. White supremacy has dehumanized Black people to such an extent that killing Black people is not only widely socially acceptable, but also a necessary function of anti-Black subjection. Any Black movement that plans on maintaining itself should be prepared to defend itself if and when necessary. Our opposition should reflect the earliest moments of Native resistance to European settler conquest, the uprising of enslaved Africans from plantations to Maroons, the Black Power revolutionary movement, and Black gangs that were born of necessity and are often far better organized than those who denounce them would ever give them credit for. The lessons of the past are here for us, should we choose to accept them and build from what they have to offer. The study of the armed struggle of Native people is foundational in creating a sustainable self-defense movement against white supremacist capitalism and those who enable it today. Understanding what worked and what did not can be helpful. It cannot be equated with oppression and assault by the powerful structures that thrive because of everyday violence. This is not a sectarian attempt to co-opt death and destruction for our own means, nor is it an attempt to attain power like that which oppresses. Rather, it is an understanding of power, privilege, and history. By starting from the moments people first experienced their objection to the U.S. project and working our way through history into the present, we can begin to understand our need for an opposition that embraces and promotes a healthy philosophy of self-defense. Our resistance against systemic oppression is not new. Rebellions against white supremacist capitalism have happened across racial lines, and Black people have taken part in them from the moment. Maroons, for example, were communities made up of predominantly enslaved Africans and indigenous people across the Americas. For centuries, these communities thrived as hubs of resistance, and sometimes they even attracted some white people who understood their marginalization at the hands of the powerful forces battling over their capitalistic and colonial interests. Nat Turner's 1831 slave rebellion is perhaps considered an anomaly during formative years in the nation's political landscape, but many similar uprisings are not as well known. In the same area where Nat Turner's rebellion took place, Southampton County, Virginia, in the Tidewater region of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, a series of conspiracies and insurrections against slavery took place between 1790 and 1810. These uprisings were a product of over 150 years of autonomous activity by slaves, servants, fugitives, and natives into the area. Neil Shirley and Sarah Lee Stafford write in Dixie Be Damned, and, quote, "This period of rebellion forever changed the scope of insurrectionary activity under slavery." Not long after Turner's rebellion, enslaved Africans and Native people in Florida engaged in what is arguably the most successful slave rebellion in American history. The launch of the Second Seminole War would provide the foundation for the first Emancipation Proclamation decades before Abraham Lincoln's. Led by the likes of John Horace, Osceola, Wildcat, and King Philip, natives, blacks, and black natives fought valiantly alongside one another against the full, unleashed force of the U.S. military. The Black Seminole contingent of this rebellion was complex. Some of the Black people fighting had been enslaved by white owners, while others had been enslaved by Seminoles or have lived with them. No form of slavery is redeemable or justifiable, but Seminoles offered enslaved Africans more rights and sometimes integration into the tribe, and they would fight alongside one another against white conquest and enslavement. The fierce fighting of those dubbed Indian Negroes is well documented in U.S. history. In 1837, U.S. Army General Thomas Jessup wrote, "The two races are rapidly approximating. They are identified in interests and feelings. Should the Indians remain in this territory, the Negroes among them will form a rallying point for runaway Negroes from the adjacent states. And should they remove, the fastness of the country would be immediately occupied by Negroes." In 1836, when General Jessup had realized that he could not effectively defeat this uprising, he had declared, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war, and if it not be speedily put down, the South will feel the effect of it on their slave population before the end of the next season." And with that, Jessup issued the first Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that all Negroes, the property of the Seminole, who delivered themselves up to the commanding officer of the troops, should be free. The first and largely unrecognized proclamation of black emancipation was secured through armed struggle and an unrelenting multi-year battle for blacks' rights to self-determination. Slave owners who had hoped that the military would return those who had escaped with the Seminoles were forced to accept defeat. While this led to momentary optimism on behalf of some black Seminoles and further compromises around black and Native emancipation and self-determination, promises made by the state were later reversed or broken, as most agreements with black and indigenous communities historically have been. After years of fighting and then engaging in the politics of their day, arguably reformists, they decided to take their fate into their own hands. Black Seminole leader John Horace worked with the state in an effort to appease his adversaries through service, policy change, and negotiation. When he was captured in 1838, he agreed to relocate some of his people in exchange for peace. That relocation compromise would be filled with broken promises. After John Horace worked as a guide and negotiator for the U.S. Army, he saw that the hopes of his people were not being realized through moderate methods. His unsuccessful petition for the government to treat black Seminoles better was not the end of the matter. The black Seminole communities were ultimately forced to simultaneously fight and flee, with many settling in Texas, Mexico, and even part of the Bahamas, among other places. The communities still exist and serve as examples of ongoing black resistance. This frequently overlooked history illustrates some lessons of revolution, repression, and reform. The Black Seminole movement, necessarily adjusting to change and state response, embodies the anarchism of blackness. The Black Seminoles' repression by the U.S. government and their alienation from certain segments of the Seminole Nation demanded that they adapt to reality. In the same way, black people today are subject to persistent repression and often are alienated from the movements of people of color who are not black. The black Seminoles fought, resisted, and retreated when necessary because any attempts at accommodation failed to benefit them in the end. Their statelessness and often deferred, if not excluded, tribal status among the Seminoles locates them in the vortex that is in the black condition, and their unique fight for self-determination highlights the intricacies of black struggle. Now, caught up in the dialogue of liberalism, many activist communities have largely been lacking a coherent conversation about self-defense. In the liberal history of the civil rights movement, nonviolence and Martin Luther King Jr. are the centerpiece, and this is held up as the right way to go about seeking social change. This has manifested frequently during rebellions, derisively called riots, often in response to incidents of state violence or extrajudicial killings. From Baltimore to Ferguson, Los Angeles, and wherever there is a black uprising, the state and its allies attempt to subdue black people by invoking nonviolence, and King, who is conveniently remembered for his civil disobedience, but not for his armed guards or gun ownership. King, Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, W.E.B. Du Bois, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, and countless other black leaders employed self-defense in theory, as well as practice to get us to this point. Many of us may relate to the words of the NAACP co-founder Du Bois' response to the Atlanta race riot of 1906. "I revered life. I have never killed a bird nor shot a rabbit. I never liked fishing and always let others kill even the chickens when I ate. Nearly all my schoolmates in the South carried pistols. I never owned one. I could never conceive myself killing a human being. But in 1906, I rushed back from Alabama to Atlanta, where my wife and 6-year-old child were living. A mob had raged for days, killing Negroes. I bought a Winchester double-barreled shotgun and 24 rounds of shells filled with buckshot. If a white mob had stepped on the campus where I lived, I would, without hesitation, have sprayed their guts all over the grass. They did not come." Legendary civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer was an outspoken advocate of peaceful methods of resistance. Her emphasis on love and morality is far more well known than her thoughts on the possibility of conflict with white supremacists. Hamer once said that hatred makes us sick and weak, but her politics of love did not contradict her embrace of self-defense. She stated, "I keep a shotgun in every corner of my bedroom, and the first cracker to even look like he wants to throw some dynamite on my porch won't write his mama again." Hamer and Du Bois are just two examples of Black people who have historically walked the imagined line between promoting self-defense and what we've come to know as nonviolence. Martin Luther King's own writings seem to affirm this balance. Violence exercised merely in self-defense, all societies, from the most primitive to the most cultured and civilized, accept as moral and legal. The principle of self-defense, even involving weapons and bloodshed, has never been condemned. When the Negro uses force in self-defense, he does not forfeit support. He may even win it by the courage and self-respect it reflects. When he seeks to initiate violence, he provokes questions about the necessity for it and inevitably is blamed for its consequences. It is unfortunately true that however the Negro acts, his struggle will not be free of violence initiated by his enemies, and he will need ample courage and willingness to sacrifice to defeat this manifestation of violence. The United States has not been bombed, destabilized, and wrecked, as have the nations whose resources it plunders. It enjoys a relative peace of sorts, absent outright war or bloody conflict that we see around the world. The violence of the state is deeply entrenched within institutions and made invisible by those institutions well enough to deceive many into believing that the life we're familiar with is acceptable. Many may feel that the apparent and relative peace of a system is comfortable, safe enough to not demand fighting for anything better despite the violence and death built into the system. But the reality of fascist white supremacist violence tells us something very different. We should prepare for individual and collective self-defense, since our turbulent history in the United States warns us this will be needed. Even the most non-confrontational and compassionate among us should understand that conflict has defined the U.S. project from its inception through genocidal, xenophobic, and anti-Black violence. Liberal appropriation and misreading of history attempt to implement respectability politics as defining Black resistance. But it is a myth that our enemies will love us or value us more as people if our appearance and behavior are more respectable, that is, dictated by white supremacist liberal sensibilities. This is so common that some young contemporary activists assert that we are not our grandparents, as if our grandparents were timid, fearful, and non-confrontational. So often they were very much the opposite. No honest telling of history will reveal a complacent Black population that passively took whatever violence was inflicted on them. Even in the face of oppressive law enforcement, a constant for Black people historically, respectability has never deterred self-defense. Ida B. Wells once wrote, "A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man who is always the aggressor knows he runs a great risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for Afro-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he's insulted, outraged, and lynched." Most of the imagined circumstantial retelling of the civil rights movement can easily be debunked. Even the nonviolent civil disobediences were far more disruptive and confrontational than public imagination often allows them to be. In his landmark book, Negroes with Guns, North Carolina NAACP organizer Robert F. Williams challenged the concept and practice of passive nonviolence, which was popular among activists like himself at the time. His work would later influence Huey P. Newton, who would become a founding member of the Black Panther Party along with Bobby Seale. Williams wrote, "The stranglehold of oppression cannot be loosened by a plea to the oppressor's conscience. Social change in something as fundamental as racist oppression involves violence. You cannot have progress here without violence and upheaval, because it's a struggle for survival for one and a struggle for liberation for the other. Always the powers in command are ruthless and unmerciful in defending their position and their privileges. This is not an abstract rule to be meditated upon by Americans. While we may choose not to limit ourselves or misrepresent the diversity of our struggle by explicitly naming ourselves as, quote, anarchists, we should nevertheless cultivate an internationalist framework and draw inspiration from movements for sovereignty and autonomy both domestically and globally. Black anarchist Lorenzo Comboa Irvin explains, two features of a new mass movement must be the intention of creating dual power institutions to challenge the state, along with the ability to have grassroots autonomous movement that can take advantage of pre-revolutionary situation to go all the way. Dual power means that you organize a number of collectives and communes in cities and towns all over North America, which are in fact liberated zones outside of the government control. Autonomy means that the movement must be independent and a free association of all those united around common goals, rather than membership as a result of some oath or other pressure.